Many years ago, I was in a writer's workshop. There were about a dozen of us, and each week we would email the others in the group, and we would attach a file, and that file would be a snippet or a chapter from a novel we were writing, or it would be a short story, or it would be a poem. And the idea was that you'd download the file, print it out, and then you'd get a pen and you'd underline the parts you thought didn't work or seemed to go against the rest of the text. You might give some suggestions. You might say, I didn't like that word, maybe you should use this word. You might question some of the characters' motives or inconsistencies among the characters. And of course it was all subjective. It was what you thought would work better. And the idea was that the author would take into account what you, everyone else, said, and maybe he or she would edit the piece to improve it, or maybe they would say, no, it's fine the way it is. I thought it was a useful exercise, getting different perspectives on something you wrote. And I remember one day, one of the guys in the group, I thought he was mediocre. I'd seen some of his writing before and I thought it was mediocre. And he came in, and I don't remember much about it. It seemed to be about a man who was out in a blizzard or whatever, and he came upon a cabin, and he got into the cabin and he was trying to thaw himself out. I didn't like the style of this guy's writing at all. I thought it was very, very simplistic. He had these sentences that went on for a full page, using the conjunction and. The man was cold, and he went up the mountain, and he scraped the snow off his boots as he entered a cabin, and I thought I could have written that at age 8. And I remember someone in the group immediately said, I presume you're a fan of Cormac McCarthy. The guy said, I am a massive fan of Cormac McCarthy. So this guy had obviously emulated Cormac McCarthy's style. That was the first time I'd heard of Cormac McCarthy, and years and years later I read one of his books, All the Pretty Horses. Didn't grab me too much. Some parts of it were interesting, but overall I thought it was average. I also noted that McCarthy used a lot of Spanish in his novel, most of which I could understand. But I was thinking, what if I didn't know any Spanish? Would I bother taking the time to look up these words and find out what they meant? There were some pages with a lot of Spanish words, short sentences. So you need it in the dialogue in some cases. In others, you'd know by the context what the Spanish meant. But yeah, McCarthy, from what I've read about him, he moved to El Paso, Texas, and he wanted to study the history of the area and the geography and all that, and he taught himself Spanish. And when I read Blood Meridian, I finished it there last weekend, I could see that the author knew a lot about that area, the southwest of the United States. He knew a lot. He knew his geography. He knew all about climate. He knew about the animals. He knew about anatomy. and obviously there was a lot of Spanish in it as well. Some of the words I didn't know them, because they were specific words, maybe a type of cart, and then in other cases he would say the word in English, and then in the next sentence he would use the Spanish version of the word. And I thought, what's he trying to do here? You know, why do that? Is he showing off? Is he saying, you know, I know the Spanish of this word? But then I thought, no, what he's trying to do is he's trying to show that the same word in two different languages can take on a slightly different meaning. I presume that's what he was getting at. And when you read Blood Meridian, you know that McCarthy didn't like convention. He didn't like orthodoxy. He doesn't like punctuation. He doesn't like grammar. In some cases, when he's putting in a Spanish word, he will include the accent over whatever vowel. And then for other words, he omits the accent. Now, I don't know if this is because his Spanish was rusty or not good enough, or for some words he cared about it being spelt correctly, and in other cases he didn't really give a damn. And that's something I did notice. He does make an effort with punctuation in some parts, and then in other parts he doesn't, which I don't really like. I prefer you're either all in or you're all out. Anyway, what do I want to say before I finish up? Blood Meridian is probably the most violent book I've ever read. I'm a bit of a fan of gore, slasher movies. And Blood Meridian overshadows all those gore movies. It's just endless violence for violence sake in many ways. And people say that McCarthy was a pessimist. His characters, the main characters in that novel, Glanton, the kid and Judge, they're all pessimists. And the Judge has some philosophical theory on violence. Might is right, more or less. The impression you get from these guys is that you've got to enjoy the rodeo while your heart is still going about doing its business. Because once your heart stops pumping, that's the end. They're fatalistic minded people. There is a link between pessimism and honesty. If you go to Albert Camus, The Stranger, the protagonist in that novel is brutally honest, and society cannot tolerate honesty, cannot tolerate it. It punishes people who are honest. I've often wondered why the Western is still so popular. It never really died, the Western genre. And I think it's because men have a hankering for a time when it was still possible for a group of men to ride out with guns and knives and strong arm a fledgling government. It was a time when manpower still meant something. I'll conclude this. I won't give any big spoilers here. I'll just say that Judge is an interesting character. I think McCarthy considered him a fallen angel or a Grim Reaper. He doesn't seem human. He seems impervious to the blaring sun of the desert, to the freezing cold mountains. He always seems to be several steps ahead of everyone else. He seems to be able to predict the future. And one of his traits in the novel is that he has a notepad or whatever, sketch pad, and he likes finding things that are rare. He likes drawing them in his notebook, and then he will destroy the real version, the original version. He's kind of like a vengeful god, a minor god, who needs to destroy the best version and maintain for himself the prototype. So he does this throughout the novel. He just finds things, draws a sketch of them, maybe takes some notes, and then he destroys it. It could be some family heirloom, it could be some old piece of Spanish armor, whatever. He'll get it, and then he'll draw it, and then he'll toss it into the flames, the original version, the only true version. The kid is a quiet character. He's also very wise beyond his years. And for him it seems to all be circumstance. He had a difficult upbringing, and he had to go out on his own at a very young age, a boy amongst men. And he becomes a man. Glanton he's a leader, but like everyone else, he's prone to his vices. He's prone to womanizing and liquor and violence. You hear the words gratuitous violence being thrown about a lot. This novel is dripping with gratuitous violence, and sometimes it doesn't really make sense. For example, Glanton, the judge, and the rest of them, the kid, the bandits, they get money from various Mexican townships for scalping Indians. And everyone in that part of the world is terrified of the Apaches. The white men are terrified of them, and the Mexicans are terrified of them. So the bandits, they get money for every Indian that they scalp, whether it be a man, woman, or child. And there's one case where they lay siege to a village. I think it's when the Indians are sleeping, and they massacre everyone. And then they find this little boy, I don't know, is he 3 or 4 years old? They find him and they decide to bring him with them. And the judge is treating him like his little son. He has him sometimes sitting on his knee. They play games with him. They feed him with pieces of meat, jerky or whatever. And then one day, the judge just scalps him, kills him. And then you wonder why. What was the point in entertaining the little child for a few days and then just scalping him? Why not scalp him before all that? So there's some sort of sadistic thing going on as well, like a cat playing with a mouse. Yeah, there is this constant sensation of physical distance and time when these bandits are trying to escape the cavalry or whatever. They look from their vantage point and they see the dust, and they might say, oh, they're 2 hours behind us, they'll be here in 2 hours time, or they'll be here in 1 hour, or they'll be here in 4 hours. So there's this constant looking out upon the horizon through the binoculars and seeing who's after them and how far they are behind. In some cases it's the Indians that are chasing them, in other cases it's government officials. Something else I almost forgot to say is that McCarthy, when this book was published, I think he sold double-digit copies in the first year or 2 years or whatever. It was a massive failure, a flop, this novel. And it was only in the following years, maybe a decade or 2 decades later, that it garnered a cult following and it became a success. It goes to show that you may fail at what you're doing, but down the line it could suddenly bear fruit. We don't know what's going on inside his characters' heads. There's no interior monologue whatsoever. It's all materialism, action. And you could even say that it's possible that his characters don't think at all. They just act. And I've heard people saying that McCarthy was competing with the movie. So he was breaking the rules again, the same way he breaks the rules for grammar and punctuation. He also breaks the rules in that he was writing books with a lot of descriptive detail. They were all more or less descriptive detail, a bit of dialogue here and there, mostly descriptive detail. And it was as if he were writing from a time that came before the movies. But in reality he was writing when movies were at their strongest. And funnily enough, he pulled it off. He pulled it off. It's like sending in the cavalry to fight a division of tanks, army tanks. McCarthy did that and he pulled it off. And perhaps the movies that have come out based on his books are like the judge's sketches, inferior to the original version. I think I've said all I want to say about this. I recommend people check out this book. I read it over a number of weeks. I dipped in and out of it. If you're squeamish when it comes to violence, blood, torture, discomfort, this is not the book for you. If you think you can make an effort and get through it, I consider it essential reading, because McCarthy, my impression of him anyway, from this book, he's the Celtic storyteller whose blood has been transplanted to a completely alien environment. The desert, the American desert, the Mexican desert. And I would say his fiction is his own mind, rebelling against the heat, the aridity, the horizons that go on forever and ever without end.